Hello and good evening. It's 7 o'clock, so I think we'll get started, and I'm sure a few more people will join us as the evening rolls on. My name is Amy Costelli. I am an associate extension professor in family consumer sciences, and my specialty area is aging and adult development. And I'm happy to be the moderator of this series, the 7-part series called Living with Loss, Playing the Hand That You Are Dealt. And we're happy to have you here tonight and to have a guest speaker with us as well. So again, thank you for taking time out of your Tuesday evening to be present for our keynote address on living with loss, healing with hope. This is the first, again, of 7 sessions in our spring webinar series. And we in FCS Extension, we recognize this wide range of losses that people confront and experience both in and outside of the pandemic. But I think that the pandemic has really forced us to face loss and grief in ways that maybe some of us didn't expect. And so we put this series together with a goal to help you know and to help us all learn that loss and grief is real and that there are ways we can learn to live with it. So this 7-part series, which we'll jot down in the chat box here in a minute, includes a real wide range of topics. Each session after tonight takes place on Thursday mornings. It'll be Thursday, starting this Thursday, April 22nd at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And the sessions include topics such as talking to kids and teens about loss and grief, self-care and nutrition, creative outlets for grief, financial resiliency, mental health, which is going to include the tough topics of suicide and substance use. And then we're going to wrap up the series with self-care and outdoor physical activity as we launch, hopefully, into a sunny and warm spring. Before I get started and introduce our speaker, I'd like to review, as we like to do with Zoom, a few of the housekeeping rules. And those include, please keeping your microphones muted. We know that there's a lot going on at home right now, and so if we can just keep some of that background noise out, that would be helpful. We also ask that if you've got questions along the way, if you could just either hold those for the end, and we'll have an opportunity about 10 or 15 minutes at the end to unmute microphones and ask those, or if you feel more comfortable, go ahead and type those into the chat box. And a couple of us here in FCS Extension will monitor that, and we'll be sure to repeat those at the end, and we can ask Dr. Bowman those questions on your behalf. There, again, will also be time at the end to unmute those mics if you prefer to ask in person. So let's get this started. To kick off this Living with Loss series, we're in really good hands tonight with Dr. Ted Bowman. Dr. Bowman is an educator, he's a consultant, he specializes in change and transition, and for over 40 years, he has been a frequent trainer, consultant, speaker with many groups throughout my home state of Minnesota, which, as many of you probably have already heard the news, it's a place of protest, introspection, and high emotion, especially over this last year. That's really come to a head in a decision tonight. He has also spoken across the United States and in other countries too. For 31 years, Dr. Bowman served as an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota in family education. He also taught at the University of St. Thomas, located in St. Paul, and worked in social work. And he was also at the United Theological Seminary in the Twin Cities. Outside of teaching, Dr. Bowman has authored over 125 articles and chapters which have appeared in a variety of books and journals, newspapers, and magazines. His booklets, Loss of Dreams, A Special Kind of Grief, and Finding Hope When Dreams Have Shattered, are widely used in grief care and available for you to access as well. You can learn more about Dr. Bowman at his website. It's Bowman, BOWMAN, TED.com, and I'll write that in the chat box as well, but it's bowmanted.com. So to not take any more time away from the session tonight, and I appreciate you hanging with me with introductions and housekeeping and just an overview of our session, it is with great pleasure that I pass the mic and introduce to you Dr. Ted Bowman.
Good evening. It's a treat to be with you. I've been looking forward to this time since Amy and I began the conversation a few months ago. And it's a delight to be with you as we deal with an important life topic of living with loss and healing with hope as part of your series. And I'm glad to have the honor of helping get the series started. So let me move to do some screen sharing here. Oops. There we go. All right, there we are. So what I want to do, just to help you to look at the agenda and where we're going, is have an overview of facets of loss, grief, hope, and resiliency. We'll move from your own self-awareness to looking at change, shattered dreams, ambiguous loss, looking at complex losses, following the metaphors of loss. Lots of people use differing words to describe the losses of their lives, and then look at reasonable hope and resiliency promotion. And as Amy mentioned, I would prefer that we not interrupt too much as I move through the slides, except if you have clarifying questions, please put those in the chat or interrupt me. Otherwise, we'll have ample time to discuss as we come toward the end of the session. So let's start with this, and I want to help you to think about these subjects that are so important to us. This is a piece of wisdom from the 13th century, a Middle Eastern poet by the name of Rumi, and he likened being human to a guest house, a lovely metaphor. This being human is a guest house, every morning a new arrival. And then interestingly, he says a joy, a depression, a meanness, the arc of things that happen in our lives, a joy, a depression, a meanness. So momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. In other words, things happen. It fits with the theme that Extension is using for this series of playing the hand that you're dealt, that things happen in our lives. But the countercultural line is the next line of the poem. It was countercultural in the 13th century, and regrettably still is to a large degree. And it was this countercultural line of, welcome and entertain them all. Welcome and entertain them all. Not welcome in the sense of spin or rose-colored glasses, not look on the bright side, rather get a second opinion, find out if it's for real. But then how do I embrace that? How do I begin to face that? Let me give you a couple of examples. A grandfather had died, and a boy came over, I think 8 years of age, a few days after the funeral to be with his granny. And he says, "Granny, do you ever want to talk about Grandpa? Or do you never want to talk about Grandpa?" How's that for a question for any of us? And the grandmother, knowing this was important, said, "There are times when I need to talk about him very much, when it helps me. But I suppose there are other times when I feel that I can't, either because it hurts too much or because it feels private at that particular moment. On the whole, I want to talk." I think it's a lovely response. There are times I don't, there are times I do, but on the whole, I'm willing and able to talk, to open the door for this child. And the child sat and digested this, and he said, "It's hard to do what you feel like, right?" She wasn't sure that she wanted to say yes or no, but she said a yes. And he said, "Let's talk about him. I'm ready." So we need people in our lives who are willing to engage with us, to welcome and entertain the discussions of a grandpa. A more modern poet than Rumi put it this way in terms of this welcoming. "Ah, grief, I should not treat you like a homeless dog who comes to the back door for a crust, for a meatless bone. I should trust you, coax you into the house, give you your own corner, a worn mat to lie on, your own water dish. You think I don't know you've been living under my porch? You long for your real place to be readied. You need your name, your collar and tag. You need the right to warn off intruders, to consider my house your own, and you my own dog. So come on in and be part of my life, if you will." So it's that we want to talk about this evening, of how do we begin to embrace losses? Because it's when predictability breaks down, things happen, a joy, a depression, a meanness. These things happen, and our predictable ways of doing things are shattered by the changing of the things that did happen. And so it's a time of uncertainty, and we wonder what to do with that. And each of us can think about times of uncertainty. And so when that happens, we experience loss. If you ask people to free associate with the words grief and loss, they're likely to say something about death and dying. Most people associate it in that way. But look at this definition. Loss refers to being deprived of or ceasing to have something that one formerly possessed or to which one was attached. Loss refers to being deprived of or ceasing to have something that one formerly possessed or to which one was attached. Let me give you some stories of loss. Think about your own, the ones you want to be addressing tonight. Because she is 10, she can take care of the family. 10 is old enough to understand a marriage going bad and people doing what it takes to keep going. That's what he told her that day, snapping the latch on his suitcase. Take care of your sisters for me. Her sisters are young and asleep. Callie is trying to hold the family together with her hands, but some days it's too big. Callie sings Tessa to sleep. Ryan hides in a corner. It's a big job being a parent, and Callie doesn't know how to do it. Think about the losses going on in that family. What if they never figure it out? Or at times we think about mundane things related to losses. This is from David Ignatow. I don't know which to mourn. Both have died on me, my wife and my car. I feel strongly about my car, but I'm also affected by my wife. Without my car, I can't leave the house to keep myself from being alone. My wife gave me 2 children, both of whom, of course, no longer live with us, as was to be expected, as we in our youth left our parents behind. With my car, I could visit my children when they're not too busy. Before she died, my wife urged me to find another woman, another partner. It's advice I'd like to take up, but not without a car. Without a car, I can't find myself another woman. That's the sum of it. So it's all of these losses that occur, and he's not only lost his wife, but his car, and that becomes a symbol of the loss of all the things of his life. And so what the body does with that is to grieve it. And the body's natural response, voluntarily and involuntarily, is to grieve it. And it can be emotional. That's the sadness, the tears, the rage, the anger. But it also can be cognitive. How fast was he driving? What does stage 4 cancer mean? They say it's someone on the autism continuum. Do we have enough money? Can we afford this? All of those sorts of questions for us. It can be a spiritual response to loss. What kind of world? What kind of God? Does this make sense? Is it fair? And it's a visceral or physical response to loss. Why am I so tired? I'm just not myself these days. I just can't think clearly right now. And so loss occurs. Well, here's an image that I'm using to describe some of the losses going on in our world right now. At the top, you see it's a 4-legged stool, but at the top, you see what we might call typical losses. And those are the ones that we're fairly familiar with: a diagnosis with cancer, or depression, Parkinson's, loss of job, a divorce, a move from one household to another, all of the things that happen in our lives. Those are not easy. They can be quite hard, but we do have common response traditions: rehabilitation, funerals, retirement parties, all of the ones that help us to cross thresholds in our lives. Some of those may shatter our dreams. Our life doesn't turn out the way that we thought it would. The plans, the hopes we had inside get shattered, and we lose our role. We lose a sense of our meaning because of that. Those are a bit more typical. Well, the one going on in Minnesota right now relates to the third one there, the state of the world. As Amy was mentioning, we've been dealing with not only the pandemic over the last 14 months, but 3 months into the pandemic, there was another death of a Black citizen here in Minneapolis at the hands of a police officer. And the verdict came down with the police officer today, and he was found guilty on 3 charges. Those kinds of stories began to appear in the work that I do. I work around conspicuous losses. I move from group to group, working with various people. So it might be a caregiver group, might be a cancer support group, might be a bereavement group, might be a job loss group. And people would be doing their work with me, and this goes back even to 2018, 2019. And they would work hard, but at the end of the session, they would turn to me and say, Ted, you know, if I wake in the middle of the night, I'm not thinking about my cancer. Or someone else would say, if they were perseverating in the middle of the day, that they're not thinking about their dead husband. Ted, I'm worried about the state of the world. And when I would push them a little bit about what they meant by the state of the world, in some cases it had to do with the ecology, the climate, had to do with leadership in our country, had to do with the haves and have-nots, had to do with some of the racial reckoning that we're going through. All of those things can be distracting us from focusing on typical losses. And then beginning in late February and early March of last year, we began to hear about this thing called COVID-19, and we've been living with it ever since. And the first reactions were not ones of loss, but ones of ambiguity and anxiety because of the unknown. Do we have to wear a mask? Can we go there? Can we go here? And we're living with it ever since. Even as we're getting vaccinated, we still are dealing with ambiguity and anxiety that adds to our senses of loss when we don't have a clear future for them. And so what I'm asking you to think about is your own self-awareness. Essentially, the only instrument that you and I bring to our losses or to responding to family members and neighbors and friends is ourselves. So the more self-aware that we are, the more present we can be in exchange with others. So what are some things that might push you over the edge? What are some things that might cause you to not be your better self, would distract you from what we might call even appropriate grieving? How do we begin to do these kinds of things? Well, here are a number of bullets of things that can exacerbate losses, to cause losses to get larger. We might even perceive that someone is making a mountain out of a molehill, that they are making something quite large, but it's their loss. And so we're there not to compare pain, but to help people with whatever their losses are. Look at the list. I won't go over each of these, but loss or stress accumulation or overload. Accumulation is from the moment of your birth until this very hour. Loss overload is the last 3 months. 6 months, a year, and we certainly are having overload with the pandemic. Losses which break normative rules. Does it make sense for a child to die first? Does it make sense for someone healthy to die of a heart attack while doing a run someday? Things that don't seem like they fit, that stretch developmental disabilities. Disenfranchised losses are those that Rumi was talking about, where there's non-permission to deal with them. Here in Minnesota, if you ask someone, how are they? The only acceptable responses are okay or fine. People seem to want us to be doing okay or fine and not to talk about our losses. And we'll talk about ambiguous losses and loss of dream. So what is it that stretches your ability to be there? What kinds of things might push you over the edge? What causes it to go to a larger number? Robert Frost has the wonderful poem, An Armful. For every parcel I stoop down to seize, I lose some others off my arms and knees, and the whole pile is slipping bottles and buns, extremes too hard to comprehend at once, yet nothing I should care to leave behind, with all I have with hand in mine. He goes on talking about the overload of the armful. Are you dealing with an armful, an accumulation, an overload of losses? And might that exacerbate your ability to cope? So ambiguous losses, I mentioned that term earlier. It's a big one for lots of people because these are the losses that are unclear and confusing, for which future stories and outcomes are unknown. A common example has to do with dementia. Who is this cross old woman for whom I can do nothing right, wrote Madeline Engel a few years ago. I don't know her. She's not my mother. I'm not her daughter. She won't eat anything we cook, so we resort to games. I do the cooking as usual, but we have to say, eat Allen's soup, grandmother. You know you like Allen's soup, and so on. And then she steps back from this and says, I know this is a classic symptom of dementia, this turning against the persons that you love most. And this knowledge is secure above my eyebrows, but very shaky below in my gut and in my heart. There's something in us which resents this rejection of roles, this reversal of roles. I want my mother to be my mother, and she's not anymore, not ever again. So there's the ambiguity. Think of other conditions that can be ambiguous. Some of the Parkinson's conditions, some depressions, just all the kinds of things that might not have clarity. Are you a person who prefers a plan and clarity? Are you a bit more willing to be loosey-goosey and go with the flow and have flexibility? Well, as it relates to the pandemic, Pauline Boss, who's written a great deal about ambiguous losses, says what's distressing us about the virus is not just the ambiguity surrounding it, what it will do and what we should do about it. Science provides some answers, but we're experiencing uncertainty. And that's very stressful for a society, for a person who is accustomed to solving problems and having definitive answers. Are you one of those people? And has the pandemic quite difficult for you because of the ambiguity? What is it about losses that is difficult for you? Or is it, and we're going to be talking about shattered dreams in just a moment, what Colin Parks calls the loss of the assumed world, that all of us from the moment of our birth begin building inside ourselves a model of the world, a set of assumptions on the basis of which we plan each day and our behavior accordingly. And because it's predictable, again, think about if you even push back 15, 20 months, what were you doing that was typical then? That's not so typical now because of the pandemic. And note this last line that I underlined. Anything which challenges our model of the assumptive world, the presumed world, can incapacitate us, can throw us off our game, if you will. Gay Becker puts it a bit differently. She says, when expectations about the course of life are not met, people experience inner chaos and disruption. Such disruptions represent a loss of the future story. And we want things to get back to normal. We want it to get back the way it was, because we often don't like to live with these shaken expectations. And so some years ago, I began to hear about what we might call shattered dreams. As I said earlier, my work is around rather typical losses that people are dealing with. And so I would be doing one of the groups, and we would ask people to introduce themselves as we started the meeting, because we thought if something's unmentionable, it's also unmanageable. And so if it was a cancer group, we simply wanted to hear a little bit of the cancer story. What kind of cancer, how long they've been living with it, who in their family, that kind of thing. And so it was trying to help people with the conspicuous losses. But as people began to share their stories, they began to share other things that I was unprepared for and was naive about. This wasn't supposed to happen. This is not fair. Why don't they warn you? Didn't think that would ever happen in our family. And finally, in one of the sessions, someone said, it sounds to me, said this to another person, it sounds like you had a picture of your life, picture of the way your life was supposed to be, and life hasn't turned out to match the picture. Sounds like you had some dreams, and those dreams are gone. Those dreams are shattered. And so shattered dreams has to do with losing an emotionally important image of oneself, one's family, one's life, one's work, even one's death or dying, losing the possibilities of what might have been, abandonment plans of a particular future, the dying of dreams. Here's the way that Jane Kenyon put it in what we might call anticipatory shattered dreams. I got out of bed on 2 strong legs. It might have been otherwise. I ate cereal, sweet milk, ripe flawless peach. It might have been otherwise. I took the dog uphill to the birch wood all morning. I did the work I love. At noon, I lay down with my mate. She goes through the day. And at the end, she says, I slept in a bed in a room with paintings on the wall and planned another day just like this day. But one day, I know it will be otherwise. Have you experienced an otherwise day? Have you experienced a kind of shattered dream? So let's look at a couple of examples. Here are shattered dreams of families with kids with special needs. The dream of the normal child, the dream about how a home should be, the dream of family privacy, the dream of family again. Here's the way that one mother put it. Autism knocked on my door in the middle of a life I thought was under my control. It swept through my house and cleared away all fantasies, pictures, and maps of the family I was supposed to have had. A shattered dream, having a child with special needs. On the other end of life is what we might call the examples of shattered dreams in elders, which could include the dream of retirement, the dream about how or where a home should be to stay and want to sleep in my own bed, want to stay in my own home, or do we have to move into a group living facility? The dream is being seen as competent, the dream that the family relationship could withstand any stress or challenge. Do we have enough money to do this? All of those kinds of things related to being an elder and the shattered dreams that go with that. My mom and dad moved into an assisted living. Dad was living in a body that was falling apart. Mom was living with dementia. And he called a few weeks after we had talked with them, and my brothers and I would move them there. And I called him and talked one day, and he said, if you're not careful, you could give up in a place like this. I thought, oh my, have we put them in a place that's not appropriate and is not clean or whatever? And he said, you don't have to do a damn thing around here. It was in an assisted living, so they had the 3 hot meals a day. The medications were provided at the proper time. If the laundry was left on the door, it was clean the next morning, and so on. That was not the dream that he had. He lost his sense of being competent. If he wasn't able to do something, he might even prefer to die. There are the shattered dreams. Think about those, and does that fit any of the losses that you might want to discuss with me shortly? So here are some questions, might be called STEM questions, that can help us assess, is this going on, or is this happening, or is this just a disappointment? When you pictured this time in your life, what did you picture? When you pictured being 37 or 77, what did you picture? When you thought about being a parent, a grandparent, a retiree, being ill, living with cancer, how did you picture that? And what I want you to think about is, are the pictures inside different than the way that you picture yourself at this moment or when that occurred? When you thought about losses in your family, how did you think it would be? How did you think it would happen? Was there a future plan that also has been interrupted by whatever circumstances in your life? Tell me about the plans that you had for the future and what you might want to do. Was it the plan of travel or something else? So what I'm trying to say by all of this gets at a core. There are theories that explain symptoms, verifiable diagnoses, effective medicines, protocols of treatment. That's what I was describing as some of the routines that we know of rehabilitation and funerals and so on. But what I'm trying to help you with this evening is it's the calming alliance and the mutual telling and retelling, revising of our living and dying story that's at the center of the work. We need to share our stories of loss in order to cope with the losses. Because, as I said earlier, if something's unmentionable, it's also unmanageable. Wendell Berry, the great Kentucky poet, your neighbor there, says we must call out all things by name out of the silence again to be with us. We must find names for them. But at times we may tell them a bit slant. Emily Dickinson, the famous poet, it's hard for some of us to tell the facts, but we tell our truth, but tell it slant. And then you remember the Paul Simon song years ago, people talking without speaking and hearing without listening. And we might not disturb the sound of silence. And so we need to bring it out and begin to speak about it. And what we know is that some people use metaphors. It's hard for some people to say the D word. It's hard for some people to say the C word, cancer, the D word, death, and so on. And so they use metaphors. A common one after a death is, I fell into a hole. I just fell into a pit. I just fell off a cliff. I just am in this dark place that I don't want to be. They use a metaphor. And what I want to suggest to you, and it comes from Richard Kopp, is the importance of noticing metaphors and following the metaphors. Paul Rosenblatt, a colleague of mine at the University of Minnesota, said that we often overlook metaphors, even especially if they're used by an intimate in our lives. And so let me give you an example with the whole. If someone says, as is said in the fiction book, The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry, I miss her all the time. I know in my head that she's gone, but I still keep looking. The only difference is that I'm getting used to the pain, the grief. It's like discovering a great hole in the ground. To begin with, you forget it, that it's there, and you keep falling in. After a while, it's still there, but you learn to walk around it. So we're beginning to follow that metaphor with that particular widower. And so if someone says, I fell into a hole, you may want to ask them, would you tell me about the hole? Find out, is it a congenial place or is it an off-putting place? Have they been in this hole before? Because what we know is that whatever is our current loss often reminds us of previous losses. So it may be a familiar hole. Can you share this whole with others? You've shared it with me. To find out, is this something that they're able and willing to talk about it? If I were seeing it the way you see it, what would I see? To practice curiosity and follow their metaphors. Now, people may use words that don't sound as if it's metaphorical. I just can't do this. I'm in over my head. This is beyond my comfort zone. Well, until we follow their words, we don't know what they're saying. What is it that they can't do? What is it that's beyond their comfort zone? How can we be helpful to them? And so I'm urging you to be alert to follow the metaphors that people use as we begin to talk with them about their losses, and even to be aware of what your own metaphor might be saying. So let's look for a moment at some of the differences between what we might call chronic sorrow and complicated grief. Both contain sorrow that can be ongoing. Both contain elements of depressive emotions, the sadness and experiences. The key difference is the ability to experience life fully, experience joy and fullness regularly, while also grieving. That may involve a chronic sorrow, one that's not going to change. We live with certain conditions that won't get better, but we can still experience joy. This is from Nell Noddings. Joy as a seemingly real quality in this world can invade us even in pain and periods of deep grief. It does not seem to be the case that joy and grief can occur simultaneously, but they can occur alternately. That is, the pervasive emotion may be grief, and yet joy can slip in momentarily. So it may happen that even in the deepest sorrow and regret and despair, I may still see and feel joy there in the world trembling at my fingertips. So it's the ability, even with an ongoing sadness, to have an experience of joy. Again, a personal example, I mentioned that my mom had moved into the fog of Alzheimer's over a period of 6 years or so. And so there was a period toward the end of her life that she didn't seem to know my name or my brother's names. We weren't quite sure just what she even knew about us. But I walked into her room one day and she looked up at me and said, "Oh, my, you're a handsome fellow. Come here and sit beside me." And I began to smile and cry at the same time. Because here was my mom looking up at me and still being the cheerleader and saying, "Oh my, you're a handsome fellow." But she wasn't saying my name. And I wondered, did she say this to all the men who entered her room? Did she say this to others? Because there wasn't the memory, there wasn't that deepness. And so I was crying and laughing at the same time. We can experience that mixture of joy and sadness. I want to talk about that a bit later, more in terms of an oscillation model between restoration and grieving. And so again, to reinforce what I've been doing with you for some time is to help you to name the losses, whatever they are. Shattered dreams, the assumed world, the state of the world, the ambiguity of it, to grieve the losses, to help people put the loss in perspective. How big and important is this to them? It may be something inconsequential to you, but it may be a big one to them. Tell people to reinforce and build their support connections. Bob Beninga, School of Public Health here at the University of Minnesota, says those who get through a tragedy, those who get through a rough patch in their lives, point at least to one person who stood by them, supported them, and gave them a sense of hope. Who's there for you? Who can you turn to? We may need to set limits, saying no to some things so that we can say yes to some others. And then what are your parts of a healing plan to help you to find joy and promote hope? What do you turn to that may help you to get through a rough patch in your life? Is it music? Is it Mother Nature? Is it comfort food? Is it touch? Is it being with your family? Is it faith? What might it be as we begin to think about these various experiences? So I've given you lots of words. Let's look at these jars and two images related to grief. If you look at the top row of 3 jars, and the stone in the jar there at the front is dominating the whole jar. That's often at the time of onset, the time of a death, the time of an exacerbation, the time of an assessment, a diagnosis. It dominates, it becomes the dominating narrative. But over time, we learn to live with things. And it's still there, the stones are still there, but we learn to live with it. A father was feeding his son by a feeding tube, And a man friend was there with him one day and said, "How the heck do you do that?" He said, "Well, if I thought about it too much, I probably wouldn't be able to do it. It's simply the way I feed my child." So that it's over time that we adjust. That's one of the ways that we deal with grief. But look at the second row of jars. What if this is one of those chronic sorrows? You see the stones in the jars are the same size in the first, second, and third jar. It could be the first year, the third year, the 10th year. But note what happened to the jars. It's the ability to grow life and expand your jar even when you're living with a chronic sorrow. That's one of the ways that we cope and live with these kinds of changes in our lives. So what I'm talking about is that we, as humans, we have a task, and it's to story and restory after disruptive changes. And so it involves grieving the old story before creating the next, not necessarily new story. So to listen for major components and themes and values of the old story to see how they can be reframed and taken with you into the new story. Here's an example from a child. I wonder how many of you are firstborns. This is from Judith Viorst. My mom says I'm her sugar plum. My mom says I'm her lamb. My mom says I'm completely perfect just the way I am. My mom says I'm a wonderful, special, terrific little guy. My mom just had another baby. Why? Think about it. If you're the firstborn, the king or the queen, everybody's doting on you. And then something begins to show up in mother's belly or arrives with some strange word called adoption or foster care. It's not unheard of that a child might say, we don't need another one. In fact, my wife and I had that to happen to us. Someone knocked on the door and I opened the door and there was a 6-year-old boy that I knew from down the lane. And he said, "Would you like a baby?" Startled me. I thought he was talking about a cat or a dog, a gerbil, a hamster. He said, "My mom's pregnant and we don't need another one." He was beginning to change his story. He knew he was going to have to share a room, his toys, and his story was changing. That happens to us throughout our lives, that we need to revise our story and do what Tom Addick says, that we need to relearn our world. Michael, a narrative therapist, Michael White, calls it the reauthoring of our story. And so after losses, we have to reintroduce ourselves to someone else and begin to define a new way of describing ourselves. Carla Holloway had the experience of having a child die first, and there's no word for a parent who's had a child die like there is for a spouse with widow or widower. And so she went searching for words and couldn't find a word and went back to Sanskrit and realized that in Sanskrit, the word for widow or widower means empty. And so that's the basis of that word. And she found that there was another word in Sanskrit called vilomah, V-I-L-O-M-A-H, and it's against the natural order. V-I-L-O-M-A-H, against the natural order. And she just needed a word to help her to reauthor who she was now that her child had died. We all cope in different ways, and sometimes it takes that kind of relearning and reauthoring of our world. So what I'm getting at, and we're beginning to look at responses, and I want to have you share some of the ways that you cope, and I want to share some as well. If we do this well, we do what we call resiliency, and it's the capacity to spring back and adapt to adversity, or to spring forward after a death, after a diagnosis. Anne Maston says it comes from ordinary resources, what she calls ordinary magic, that we learn some ways to cope with the things that happen in our lives. I'm wondering what helps you to cope and be resilient. William Stafford calls it the thread. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change. People wonder what you're pursuing. You have to explain about your thread. It's hard for others to see. Tragedies happen. People get hurt or die. You suffer, you get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding, but you don't ever let go of your thread because it's the thread of resiliency. Again, your neighbor, Wendell Berry, says if he wakes in the middle of the night in despair for the state of the world or for fear for his grandchildren, he goes into the peace of wild things and lays down where the woodrake lays, has no thought of grief, looks up at the stars and the moon, and he gets better. That's what we mean by resiliency promotion. What is it that helps you to promote your resiliency? Here's this oscillation model that I mentioned earlier, the ability to Spend time with the loss orientation there on the left. I've spent lots of time here at the front end introducing the series to you to help you to think about losses. But look at the ability to move back and forth, to look at the other side, to attend to life changes, to do some new things, to begin to have distraction, denial. It's the ability to move, as I said earlier, from joy to grief, from grief to joy. Here's my own story of it. I had here in the midst of the pandemic, had the awful experience last July to have my wife of 41 years to die suddenly of cardiac arrest. And I miss her greatly. She had no heart condition, and yet she died of a massive heart attack. Here's a piece I wrote about 3 months after Marge died. I will color this time with more than a black armband. Some of you may know that in an earlier time, at times of death, people wore black or a black armband as a sign that there was a death in the family. I will color this time with more than a black armband, a past marker of death. I will reach for brilliant, bold, bright colors and beiges and blues and blush. I yearn for an array of color, similar to the rainbow of flowers sent so soon after her death, reminding me of the colorful life that we shared and that I can still have. So I'm grieving, I miss her greatly, but I'm trying to oscillate between times of grieving and times of restoration. So just this piece to try to help you how to be with others. And it's this issue of compassion. Compassion optimally involves a quality of presence that conveys stability and resilience, that we are willing to be with another at the time of their losses. We don't abandon them, but we're willing to be with them. With a basic balanced concern and heartfelt connection, that's the empathy. We try to meet them where they are, but to hear their story, but it's not depleting or overwhelming to either person. So that if we're there to be with their grieving, we don't have to overwhelm them with our grieving. We leave that for another time and place. We do that with someone else. And so it's what we call compartmentalizing, that we can be with another and show our compassion. And it might even help us with our own healing as we move to talk with someone else about our own needs and our own losses. So it's that kind of experience that we do. Extension workers are asked to do that with their publics. And so let's talk for just a moment about hope, honest hope in the face of these kinds of losses. I have 2 slides, and then we're going to move to 15 minutes or so of discussion. If you look in the dictionaries or the thesauruses, there are many definitions for hope, but most come around to expectation or desire, which can, even after losses, involve goals that you want to set, attributes of courage, of patience, of persistence, of asking for help, redefinition, there's the reauthoring, finding some meaning, pass on some meaning that you can to a way of living with these kinds of things, finding some serenity, some energy, whatever it is that helps us to move forward. Katty Weingarten puts it in 5 bullets. She says, reasonable hope is relational. Remember, I said earlier that Bob Vaninga here says that those who get through tragedies do best if they have at least one person in their corner who brings hope and provides that relationship. Reasonable hope is a practice and a goal. Look at number 2 and 4. Means that you don't leave it to good intentions. Don't hope that just the next day will be better than the last day. Things happen. Remember the Rumi poem that we started with. Every day a new arrival. So we need to have some stability in our lives, practices and goals that help us to anchor ourselves in the midst of ambiguity. The health department here in Minnesota has said in the midst of the pandemic, we need to try to have 3 good meals a day. Need to have some sleep patterns that are constant. Need to do some things that help us with healing. A woman in a caregiver group that I led knew that if she didn't go swimming at least once a week, she was not going to be a good caregiver of her husband. So it's a practice and a goal. There in the middle is the ambiguity again. Reasonable hope maintains the future is open, uncertain, and influenceable. The choices that we make can influence. The direction in which we look will determine what we see, that we can begin to influence our own hope, our own well-being. And then the bottom one is one that's quite hard for lots of people. Reasonable hope accommodates doubt, contradictions, and despair. And that's where I would turn you back again, that we can even experience joy and kindness in moments of despair. It's been seen in lots of places that people can, in the midst of their own despair, can still do wonderful things for one another. And I hope that you've experienced some of that. So I'm going to move from sharing the screen to have you, if you will, if you are willing and able to show us your faces, that would help. And then if you will use the chat or the Q, I guess it's the chat with this particular technology. I'm eager to hear questions, or if you're willing to share resources that you have found or seen others use that seem to help people live with losses, that would be beneficial to all of us. Let's share some of our wisdom as well as address questions that you have. So Amy and Mindy are going to help me with reading the chat and giving me some of the questions so that we can have a conversation with each other. Let's make this rich over the next 15 minutes. Do you have some there, Amy?
Nope, right now we don't have any new questions in the chat, so hopefully people are going to unmute and actually talk.
Okay. Or if you're more comfortable writing it, they can handle both.
Yep, absolutely. We'll keep our eye on it.
Okay. So what questions? How can I be helpful? Are there resources you're willing to share with the rest of us? I've named some of the ways that I've coped with some of my losses and tried to share stories of other people. Let's help one another for a few minutes.
Dr. Bowman, while people are trying to think, I know a question that I get asked sometimes is, people will say things like, I don't think I'll ever get over this death. I don't think I'll ever get over the loss of my spouse or the loss of my partner or my child. What do you suggest people do who feel that way, especially with the loss of a loved one, when there's such a hopeless feeling in their heart?
Let me speak to that, because I think some people have said that in part because they think that we should get over it quickly. The old rural notion that get back on the horse, life goes on, start over. Even the earlier use by Elizabeth Cooper Ross, which she later rejected, of the stages of grief, that we were to move through these stages and we would be to the place of acceptance and living with something. Anna Quinlan a few years ago that said 20 years after the event, 20 years after the onset, we might experience the continual presence of an absence. How's that for a phrase? The continual presence of an absence. I'm guessing some of you women have had breast surgery, the continual presence of an absence. Or if we've experienced a death, we still miss the persons, even though we've gone toward restoration and are living well. To put it bluntly, loss is forever, but it does mean that we can get over it in the sense of living with it. It's not life after loss, it's life living with loss and learning to live with loss, but what some people call continuing bonds, that we keep it as a part of my life. I'm living in an apartment that my wife and I created just 3 years ago. Her image and her life is all around me. I miss her, but I love this place because we created it together. So it's life living with loss. It's not life after loss. And yes, I'm grieving immensely, but I'm also glad I had 41 years with her. So that's what I mean by living with loss. So it's not getting over it, but learning to live with it.
So I have something that maybe I could share.
Okay.
I lost my father in July, and I lost my mother in 2012 to a car accident. So life changed dramatically after my mother. We lost her, and we lost a piece of my father too. I mean, that was just such a struggle to get through all that. But now that they're both gone, for me, the best way to cope with all of that is celebrating their memories. There were such rich memories, and looking back through their entire lifespan, they had a tough life, but they were tough folks. And it's been a pleasure to study their history and kind of remember who they really were and all that they have achieved. And it's been a very healing process for me. So I don't know where that fits into the scale of anything, but
Okay.
that was good.
Yes, thank you, Brenda. It's what we call a living legacy, that we have a gold mine in our backyard of legacy and memories and history. Some of those need to be transformed because some people may not have the positive memories that Brenda has had. You might have had a rougher kind of childhood and so on. And so we need to to see how we might do it differently. And what have we learned even from some of those hard times that I want to do it differently with my children? I want to do it differently with my life. One way that some people talk about it is an ethical spiritual will. What have I learned from my living with cancer? What have I learned from earlier deaths? What have I learned from my job loss that's worth sharing with others? That's what we might call an ongoing legacy. And yours is quite positive, and I certainly applaud what you're doing, and many of us can do that we've got those pleasant memories that can help us with our own healing. But it's also, how can we honor the people who have died with a living legacy?
Dr. Bowman, we have a question from Facebook. How
Okay.
do you deal with the anger? I find that I feel this anger that I don't know what to do with.
Okay. Well, the first thing that you do is what you just did with us, and that is to name it. Because if it's unmentionable, it's also unmanageable. And so by naming that, you're beginning to say, I need to give that attention. A couple of things I would suggest to you is there are legitimate, righteous reasons for us to be angry. But often anger is a secondary emotion, and underneath that anger are more primary emotions of being overlooked or dissed or embarrassed or intimidated or isolated or overwhelmed. And so I would urge you to not only pay attention to the anger that you have, but listen for the emotions, and your body may be speaking some of those emotions of hurt and disappointment that's underneath the anger, and be attentive both to the anger, but also to the other emotions that then cause it. Then we get angry because we are being overlooked or dissed or embarrassed or whatever, and we get angry at the world in that sense. And so, so by naming it first, and then to try to be attentive to all that it's saying, not just the anger, but also the accompanying emotions. And certainly if you need help around that, because all of us do, we're not always our best caregivers of ourselves, there are two kinds of resources I would point to. Pauline Boss says that we have two kinds of families. So this is one. I love what she says about this. She says we have two kinds of families. One is the family of no choice, the relatives, the legal family, the adoptive family, the nuclear family, and that can be wonderful. She's not saying that in a negative and so on. That can be wonderful. And we might not know the difference between that and the other one that she names. She says we also need to have a psychological family. And those are the people who are there for us when we need them to be there. And they may not be the relatives, because some families have a no talk rule. I don't want to hear that. Don't bring that up. You know, you talk about that all the time. Well, if our family are a bunch of people like that, then we need to have another family. And those are called friends. Those are called neighbors. Those are called colleagues. And they are called professionals. And part of my understanding, and Amy, you may want to even to speak to this, is that the reason for this series is that your county extension agents are wanting to be more resources in your parts of Kentucky to help you to find resources to deal with losses. Some people call them paid friends. That can sound a bit crass, but sometimes we need a professional to help us with our anger or with something else. And so I would urge you to explore those kinds of ways. Are there people that you can lean on? One quick example, a tangible example. I walked out of a care facility one evening with a woman whose husband was dying of a brain tumor. I'd sat with her for 2 hours and him, and I'd done that before. I was willing to do it again. And as I walked out of the care facility with her that evening, I turned to her and said, "Is there any other way I can be helpful?" And she surprised me and said, "Would you mind cleaning up my house?" I hadn't expected that. I was willing to offer lots of things, but and I told her, I said, no one's ever asked me to do that before. Help me out here. And she said, "Ted, it's so hard to be here in this place of death and dying every day and then go home to a dirty house. I just don't have the energy to clean it anymore." So guess what I did? I cleaned her house. So some people just need tangible support. So are we willing to ask for help? I encourage caregivers, because sometimes I'll have people to say, oh my gosh, you're such a wonderful caregiver. I wish I could do something to help you. And it's almost as if the caregiver has to decide what the other person can do. And so part of what I urge caregivers to do is to begin to create a menu of things that someone can do, like clean their house or give them a massage or do some shopping or whatever. And so if someone says, I just wish I could help you in some way, you're just the most amazing 24/7 caregiver I think I've ever known. Oh, are you willing to? Here's a list. Look and see if there's something on the list that you're willing to do. That we need to be our own caregiver at times and create a list in which our friends can help us with something.
So we need to, when we make the offer, we need to mean it.
We need to mean it.
We should not make an empty offer, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
When I experienced my first significant death, which was the death of my brother, I was in my 20s. I was just talking about this earlier on a podcast today. And that was something I learned, Dr. Bowman, and to everyone listening. I remember all these people would come to my family and to me and say, let us know what we could do. And I just thought, I'm never going to ask you to come over and make an omelet for my parents because they're too sad to get out of bed and function this morning. And it was the people who came over and actually did something that we didn't ask them to do. You know, it was the people who, no one came to clean the house, but it was the people who came to clean the house. It was the people who brought something. It was the people who actually did something for my parents, even months after the death, that were so meaningful. And I think about that. And I think if someone asked me tomorrow to say, could you run me out to the airport? It wouldn't even dawn on me. I'd be so happy to help. Yet we have such a hard time asking for that help, especially in that vulnerable, really sorrowful time. And I thought at that, it was, again, almost 16 years ago, but I thought I will never, ever, ever ask someone, let me know what I can do. I will just do something for them. That was my lesson.
Right. Take some initiative. Amy grew up in Minnesota. We call it the Minnesota hot dish. That if there's a death, people come running in with the hot dish. And what we might need to do is to say, no more tuna salad, please. No more tuna salad.
Right. So we have a couple of other questions, a lot actually, that I'm seeing here in the chat. Here's one that someone asked, does loss get easier when you develop post-traumatic stress disorder from that loss?
That's one that could take a bit of time to address. If you really have a stress disorder and post-traumatic, that may be one of those where you might need some professional help, because what we know about a lot of the traumas is that they not only affect us emotionally, but they can affect us physically. And we might need someone who sees whole person care and can help us to sort through what's the difference between the trauma I experienced if I saw an automobile wreck, for example, or came upon a dead body or whatever might have precipitated the trauma. Certainly we know of the military people returning from have experienced some of that trauma. What's the difference between that and what we might call normal grieving? And that's where the professional may be able to help you to look and see that maybe it's not post-traumatic trauma that you're dealing with, but it's normal grieving. And if you can begin to see that as normal, then maybe there could be a way in which you can relax a bit instead of it. But if you need help with the trauma, to get the kind of help that you deserve.
Dr. Bowman, this question kind of goes along the same lines of what maybe normal grieving may be. And the person asked, why do some years seem easy and you think you're okay, and then the next anniversary of the death hits harder than ever?
Grief is unpredictable. It can creep up. It's what some people call being ambushed or being triggered. That you are copacetic, your life is full and good, you're even driving down the highway, let's call it, and a song comes on the radio that reminds you of someone that was dear to you, a favorite song, or you go into a restaurant and you smell a smell, and so on. All of those are what we call triggers. And that's what Anna Quinlan was talking about, that 10, 15, 20 years after the onset, you can experience the continual presence of an absence. A bit tongue in cheek, but did talk with the managers of some of our food markets here in Minnesota, some of our large grocery stores, and said, "Do you have a crying room? Do you have a crying room?" And they said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, lots of people pushing their carts up and down the aisle will see something that reminds them of their mother's cooking and will start crying in aisle 5. And that's what I mean by a trigger. It can be something that is not a big deal, but all of a sudden there you are. You need to pull over to the side of the road because the song just caused you to weep, and that it reminds you of your dead child or your mother or something else, that kind of thing.
This person asked, losing my job has caused me to lose my sense of self. I'm having trouble redefining myself.
Yep, that's it relates to the shattered dream. And a couple things I would suggest there. And I would suggest you do that with someone that you trust, in terms of someone who can give you competent and honest feedback. If you are, and I presume you are, competent and handle things well, you need people to tell you are, because if there's a loss of job, and it may not have anything to do with your ability, but it's because of redundancy, because of the economy, because of the pandemic, because of lots of things that may not have anything to do with your character, with your own well-being, of who you are, but you were the one who got the short stick, and so you were made redundant, or you're no longer part of that workplace. Then you need to get the feedback about your competency and someone to help you to also, as you're doing your resume, if you're applying for new jobs or meeting with would-be employers, that you go in with your better self and not your depleted self, so that you see that you still have those abilities. And it's simply that you were part, think about it during the pandemic, the people in the restaurant and entertainment industry who lost their jobs, not because of anything that they did not do, but simply because of the economy, and that those businesses were closed. And lots of those businesses are not going to hire people back right away, because we aren't opening up the restaurants and the entertainment industry very fast. And so try to get some fair feedback about who you are and your competency as a person.
I think this is a really important question too, and asked quite a bit. Sometimes when people try to move on or move forward, others judge them for it. Is there a response to those comments, or a way to deal with that when you're treated that way?
Well, the general response around any kind of grieving is one size doesn't fit all. And so if someone says you're doing it too fast or you're doing it too slow, at least part of my, if I were you, I would urge you to say, we don't all do it the same. We don't all have the same pace. We don't all do it at the same speed. And realize that some people may appear that they're doing it, quote, too fast, but that may be their way of coping. You know, some studies of gender issues after a death of a parent show that men often go back to work quicker than do women, the sisters and brothers. For example, if a mother or father died, that the man will go back to work quicker than the working sister might go back to work. Is that because his grieving is over? No. Some of them are doing that because that's their way of coping with grief. They need to get back to some normalcy. So that's the work. And it's a distraction from their grieving, because if they stayed home much longer, they would be struggling with their own grieving. But then they began to do the compartmentalized. They work, and maybe even work well, but then on nights and weekends, they might do some of their grieving. And so they look as if they are doing things normally and getting back to routines, but their grieving may happen in differential ways, that some of us do it, stay in it for some time, and some people begin to move back into a distracting routine. That's the restoration, that ability to oscillate, move back and forth, but to allow ourselves to also have our moments of grieving.
And someone shared too that, they lost a grandmother when they were in college and felt so stoic when it first happened, didn't even cry. And then 6 months later, it was one of those grief triggers, shopping and seeing someone else with their grandmother. And then, here came the tears for hours and hours as the finality of not being able to spend time with that person you care about really kind of sets in. Certainly something I think a lot of people do.
Yeah, well, let me speak to that as well as the previous question in terms of timing. I urge people to consider having multiple funerals, which when I say that may sound a bit bizarre, but what I mean by that is the example you just used, Amy, is that a grandparent's death when someone was adolescent or in college, they may not have realized the severity of it, the impact of it. And it may even be not 6 months later, but maybe 5 years later. Maybe it's when they have their own family starting, and maybe they're even creating their own family, having their own children, and they begin to miss a parent or a grandparent. Well, that may be a time to have what I call another funeral. And what I mean by that is simply to gather with people that are your associates and people who might have known grandma, for example. Light a candle, have a photo of grandma, talk about some of her attributes, talk about what you missed, because that's where the grieving can occur. I've been a bit concerned with so many people during this pandemic who have postponed the funerals until a later time when they can do it in person. I understand that part, but I've urged people who have had a death in the pandemic to have a small funeral now. Gather again with a circle of people that you can be with, even if you have to do it outside, light a candle, share some stories, all of the rest, because we need to honor that loss. And it may be that we need to have multiple events. Again, it's a personal story, but I mentioned that my wife died in July. We decided as a family to go ahead and have her funeral about 2 weeks after she died for a lot of reasons. Don't need to go into those reasons. And so it was going to be a funeral via Zoom. Now, had my wife died at a non-pandemic time, there might have been, I don't know what, 150, maybe 200 people that would have come to the funeral. I'm not saying this in a braggadocious way, but it's the power of Zoom and the positives of Zoom. Can you believe this, that we had 383 computers at my wife's funeral? People from all over the United States, because we have friends on the East Coast and the West Coast. We have friends in Europe. We've traveled a great deal. We've worked in lots of places and so on. And it was just so heartwarming for us to realize that 383 computers, what does that mean? 500 people were there at my wife's funeral. And what they said was that it was healing for them. And it was amazingly healing for us. So what I'm trying to say is use that more as a metaphor of I'm urging you to be creative in the way that you express your grieving. That's what I mean by the multiple funerals.
I think
And that resonates with me as well, Ted. And someone else just wrote in the chat box, some friends who are Greek Orthodox have the 1-year anniversary of the death of a loved one, and how they think it's a great idea to do because it helps you celebrate those memories a year after the funeral. And again, what I remember, especially that first death that I talked about when my brother died, was so many people are so helpful and thoughtful and caring for like the first 2 weeks. And then everyone's life has to go back to normal. You go back to work, and the people who'd come into town to visit and stay with you, they go back and their lives go back to normal. But you think my life is never going to be normal again. My parents' life will never, ever be normal again. And it's like people forget. And then they, someone else said in the chat, you might say something awkward, so then you say nothing at all. Yeah. So then it's like this person who meant so much has never even thought about it again because no one wants to say on his birthday or on a significant whatever, hey, this made me think of so-and-so because I don't want you to cry. And so I do like that idea of multiple funerals, or like in the Greek Orthodox Church to say, let's have another celebration a year later, because I think that helps me know that you still care about my dad or my brother or whoever, my grandmother, whoever it might be. Because I think sometimes when we're left behind, we start to think other people forgot them, and that hole is still in my heart.
Yep.
I think that is great. I have another question from Facebook. I lost my mother to cancer, and my spouse left a short time afterwards. He has moved on, but I have never. How do I communicate to my children that holidays with him and his significant other is still, after 15 years, too painful? I feel like a third wheel.
Well, again, I appreciate your willingness to name that. That's the first step toward trying to figure that out. A couple of thoughts I have. One is that it may be helpful for you to let the children and their dad have whatever experiences they have together and know that that's theirs, it's not yours. And so, but then choose what you might want to do with your children and when you want to do that. And so don't focus on the time they're having with their dad, but focus on the time that you can have. It's a bit of the serenity prayer, I think is what I'm saying. What can you control? What can you not? The children need to have their time with their dad, but they also need time with you. And so just find ways to celebrate that. And if there are some of the other family deaths that you were naming that you want to commemorate with the children, that you can be part of that, and those can occur in some ways. The part that you mentioned that is a bit more mysterious is when you talk about moving on. I'm guessing you have moved on in some ways, but not in others. And so look to see what it is that you need to let go of in order to help yourself take some steps forward. It's not all done at once. It's a step at a time, a day at a time, and some of the things that you might want to adjust, but to look to see what you can control, what you cannot, and to focus more on your time with your children rather than the time that they're having with their father.
We've had a couple of people write in, Dr. Bowman, about the power of prayer. And I don't know if you can kind of speak to that in general terms, but a couple of people have had losses that happened many years ago, up to 25 years ago, and they're still having a hard time with that. It was multiple losses. It was sudden loss, unexpected loss, and then that gets complicated with recent loss. How do you help someone who's going through something like that and feels so overwhelmed?
Again, it's a multi-layered one. I'll try to address it in a way that honors the question, because it's an important one. One is to know if part of your prayer life is, what shall I say, is colored because of these losses. Know that you're in good company. Read the Psalms in the Older Testament. A third of the Psalms are people who are, where were you, God, when I needed you? How could this occur? And so on. And so they're having the conversation with God, but it's a part of the prayer. And some of their angst about what has happened. Other parts of the Psalms and other parts of scriptures and all of the world's traditions are ones in which there is the consoling, the loving presence of God, and the prayers may be beneficial in that way. So trying to be aware that prayer is not always one-sided, that we can have our prayers of where we're overwhelmed with what life is bringing us, and we're pleading in some ways for our own self-awareness of knowledge and things that we can do to be helpful for ourselves and the help of others. Related to what I was saying earlier, some people may want also to move the prayers to letting some people in your life know some of the things that you're praying about, because you may be feeling isolated, cut off from your church community, from others of faith because of what's happened in your life, and to speak with them about that so that you can share your faith stories. And how can we re-enter our places of worship and spiritual meaning after these kinds of losses, and to let people know that we still want to be with them, because we may at times exit ourselves or feel a bit embarrassed about going to those places because we're not quite sure that we will fit the mold, because lots of people in those places regrettably want us to be better. And some people even use, let me be quite blunt about it, some words that can be quite offensive to people about faith. And it may not be your faith, but when someone says they've gone to a better place, that may not have lots of resonance for some people. They may not want to hear that because you don't, if God is a loving God, why did God take, and so on, that kind of thing. So we need to have people in our lives who are willing to hear our doubts as well as our beliefs, and to develop the kind of prayer life that can move again across that oscillation of our grieving as well as our joy. And so it's in the case of prayer that we have the oscillation between moments of anger and despair and moments of relief and finding spiritual food and from our faith.
Well, out of respect for people's time, we are about 8:15, and I hate to cut this off. I think that Dr. Bowman, your presentation was so helpful and so meaningful, and I hope that people found meaning in this discussion as well. I know I certainly did. I'm not usually one to share as much as I did tonight, but I really felt moved, and I do, like Dr. Bowman said, I really think we can learn from each other when we're willing to open up and share and learn what's worked for you or what hasn't worked for you, and we hope that the remainder of this series will do the same, that we can learn just different snippets and different ways that we can play the hands we're dealt, because like we all know, we're not always dealt the cards we would like to have. So Dr. Bowman, thank you so much for being with us tonight and taking your time and for opening up this series. And we hope to see all of you on Thursday morning on the 22nd at 11 a.m. for Dr.
Okay, bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
Yep, bye-bye.
Thank you.
And David Weisenhorn will be with us, and that's at 11 a.m. on Eastern Daylight Time. Thank you, everybody.